Hey Team Athena, I thought I would wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to send you some clips from some of the members of the Compass team. And the first one I'm going to send you is from Betsy. And Betsy's going to cover some of the things we covered on the very first session, but also send you some new thoughts, again on enhancing your mental and physical resilience. What that should hopefully do is just give you some more techniques so that over the next 2 weeks, when you're going out for your runs or doing training or thinking about the course to come when you come back, it will just give you those really great skill sets, as I said, to mainly enhance what I've already seen you do. I've been immensely impressed by your attitude, your energy, your thoughts already. I thought the team maps were superb, and I want to make sure that you are also connecting with the team that you have around you to keep that motivation, to keep challenging one another, but also to keep supporting one another. I'm also going to send you some clips from Jane Hanna that will talk about the physical side, and then Dr. Amanda Wilding will also send you some even really brilliant thoughts on, again, developing that warrior spirit, but also looking at the differences between males and females, and I think you'll find that fascinating. I've already just started to listen to some of the clips that they've been sending to me, and I've been sat enthralled about the different information there that they're giving me as well. If you've got any points, by all means send them back through to your team members who can send them to me, and we can look at how we can enhance some of the things that we are doing. So take care, enjoy the clips, play them at your leisure, and I'm sure you'll get some great nuggets from each of the people that you listen to. Take care.
Hi everyone, and thanks for logging in. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're watching. Pleasure to remotely deliver to you today. Not the intended method, but hopefully I'll be able to cover everything I would do as though I were there in person. I will make reference to perhaps some of the activities that we may have gone through if this were to be done in person, just to give you an idea of how some of these topics might come to life a little bit, or just to provoke some thought about how you might feel about some of these topics if you were to have more of a practical exercise or a group discussion, for example. So I'm just going to start by recapping the last session that I delivered for you back in November, which was a pleasure to deliver to you guys. So what we spoke about was the difference between, the psychological difference really, between our perception of motivation and our perception of commitment. And that I'll do it tomorrow phenomenon, or I'll start on Monday phenomenon that we spoke about. So really the conclusion of that was to view commitment as something that's a bit more stable in us as a psychological concept, if you like. So motivation to complete something or motivation to achieve your goal may not always be high. You might have dips in motivation. Motivation might fluctuate. But wherever you're at in terms of that journey of motivation, if your commitment is high, you will still be committed to your goal, even if motivation is waning for whatever reason. So it was just creating that distinction between you can have low motivation, but your commitment can still be high to complete the task. And that might look a bit different depending on what's going on for you at any given time. You know, some things in goal setting scenarios will fluctuate and change over time. We spoke about performing as a woman, that concept of being a warrior as a woman and what that's all about, particularly in light of favourable and unfavourable sexist notions. So you came up with a good few examples of things that might be said to us or things that might happen in everyday life that might be construed as sexism, and how we feel about those things, what those things mean to us, how they might be barriers in terms of performing as a woman. But importantly, we spoke about how some of those things can be motivational and can be almost coming from that underdog point of view of, you know, I'm in this situation and I'm maybe discriminated in some ways, but that's motivational to me. We had a good few of you come up and draw what successful you looks like. And hopefully those that didn't come up and draw would still be able to picture perhaps what they would have drawn, or what they would visualize as successful you, visualizing your warrior, what that looks like in terms of your expressions, your facial expression, the things you have around you, maybe what you're doing in that moment, or how you see yourself when you're at your most successful, whether that's something that's happened in the past or something you're still aspiring to do or be. We also went on a trip via the London Underground, which hopefully was a useful analogy just to illustrate that outcome and process. So that end tube station being your outcome goal, your super North Star, and the fact that that journey might be disrupted and changed throughout. And that's really the process. That's the processes that you'll take every day, every week, every month. And the site on the Super North Star or your end tube station doesn't change. So hopefully that illustration was useful. We also spoke a little bit about rational thinking. So one of you came up to the board to complete the badness scale example, which starts to get our minds to think about whether we're processing things rationally, whether after we've got all the information, whether we'd look at a situation differently, and how we can start to just consider that when things are going on for you in everyday and real life. And I also gave you the example of ABC, the thinking process behind how an event may seem like it causes us to feel a certain way, but actually what's happening is what we're telling ourselves about that situation is creating the end consequence. And that's quite an in-depth concept, so that's something perhaps we'll revisit in further sessions. And then towards the end of the session, I just touched upon that concept of mindfulness in sport. And I'm really passionate about the use of mindfulness in sport, in performance, because mindfulness sometimes gets misconstrued as just being a relaxation technique. And really that's not what all it can do, particularly in a performance environment where mindfulness can really give us techniques and give us skills to be able to stay present and make good decisions, and just to have an awareness of what we're like in certain challenging situations. You know, it can link in with self-compassion. Are we compassionate with ourselves in the right time? Are we compassionate with others? How do we make decisions when we're under time constraints or it's a very important decision? So we spoke a little bit about that. And I'd be interested to know whether anyone's explored that at all since the session. Okay, so today, again, we're keeping with that warrior theme. We're going to talk a little bit about bravery. We're going to talk about dealing with setbacks and how we actually do that, how we can start to do that. Again, that's not necessarily just a 5-minute quick fix. Momentum. We're going to talk about momentum, something that I might deliver a lot about in terms of a sporting context. So how momentum in sport, in different games with different athletes can impact how we behave, how we perceive a situation and what happens in a situation. And it's something that you hear spoken a lot about in lots of different contexts. But if we're looking at sport as an example, you'll hear commentators refer to momentum. We'll hear, you might get a betting market that changes because of momentum. So it's a really important concept to look at in terms of high performance. And this is really where I'm linking in with you guys, that what you're doing every day and what you'll do in your most challenging situations is high performance. Performance happens in, blue chip companies. Performance happens with athletes. Performance happens with surgeons and military personnel, everyone. So it's a really important topic to consider in terms of particularly decision making, which I'll link in with during the session. Resilience is something that you could probably delve into in every single session, so that's something that will definitely come up here. Being relentless, so that concept of being relentless we'll speak about today. Preparing for tough times, so how can we foresee tough times and how can that be difficult for us to do sometimes? There's a real fine line in psychology sometimes in terms of thinking about what if, what if this happens, what if planning, sometimes you might hear it called. This can be a useful thing to do because it allows us a little bit of foresight. It allows us to look at actually planning how we might intend to react about something, which can be really important in terms of how we eventually behave. But also it can be daunting, I guess, to prepare for tough times and look at what ifs, and we can get overwhelmed by that and overly negative and unhealthily negative in relation to that. So we'll explore that a little bit in a moment. What now? So I like to sort of sum up every session with, okay, that's great, you've given me this information, but what happens with that now? What goes on now? Okay, so the first slide is actually, it's literally a slide I've taken from something I delivered while I was with Brighton Academy. This picture here is Simon Rusk, who was the under-23s coach, who was at the club when I was there. And this is a slide that was taken from part of the coaching syllabus, which I worked with the head of coaching on. And it reads, how can I help, and this is me speaking, how can I help ensure a coach is brave enough to use what they might learn in coach psych in real life moments? And really this just summed up where I wanted to start today. So it's one thing hearing, what I'm talking about, or other professionals might talk to you about in a mindset and psychology vein, but how can you actually have the courage to take what's being said today and use it in real life? And how can you start to do that? And that's easier sometimes in a sporting context, where you say, okay, well, the first step to doing that is doing it in training. And then you can learn to take it into a game, and it becomes habitual and it becomes more of a norm. You get used to a change in thinking or a change in behaviour that you initiate yourself. So really, just to start with that, I thought was a good thing to maybe place in mind as we go through. How can we learn about it now, and it's knowledge and it's new information that you're taking in your brain, but how can you actually use this, and how can you actually take this into real life and start to maybe make changes that you might detect are necessary in your own performance? So we're going to talk a little bit about opposites, and if I had you in a group right now, we'd just be shouting out the opposites. So some of these are pretty obvious. Good and bad, effective, ineffective, positive, negative, success, failure, motivated, unmotivated, demotivated, lazy. There's some options to these. And the reason I've gone with opposites here is I wanted to get some thought about how performance is very much like opposites at times. You might have good or bad performance. You might be effective sometimes, you might be ineffective. You might feel positive one day, you might feel negative. You might succeed at something, you might fail at something. You might be motivated, you might not be. This is what happens in real life. I think sometimes it's difficult for someone like me as a professional that maybe feels like my job is to give you tools to go on and do well. It's hard to sometimes acknowledge that life doesn't go like this sometimes, and that performance is difficult. And it's only when you can really explore that you can really start to look at resilience and go, okay, sometimes I am going to fail. So what then? And I think it's important to just let your mind go there sometimes. So to think about, how do I actually respond when I fail at something? Let your mind take you there. How do you actually feel when you fail? Because you might learn more about yourself entertaining those ideas. And what would you see? What would you see from a warrior when things are going well? So if you've got all of those things on the left and everything's going great, performance is good, you're effective, you're positive, you've been successful, you've had a successful outcome, and you're motivated, you're strong. This is maybe what we picture when we picture a warrior. And what's the resultant behaviour? Maybe continuation of all those things. Maybe having all those things makes it easier to carry on having those things. But also, what would you see from a warrior when things are not going well? Because when we picture people that are truly resilient and truly able to come back from setbacks, there will be a response and a choice in response, which is something we're going to explore in a couple of slides' time. So I want you to think about that. This isn't all about getting you to a point where everything is good and everything's effective and you're successful all the time and you're highly motivated. Sometimes you're not. So what then? What's your response? What's your warrior response? What can you pull out of the bag then? Because things aren't always going to go well. And even if you're well-intentioned, things are going to go wrong. So it's all about that response. Just have a think about that. Now, to lighten the mood, I'm hoping you'll be familiar with this amazing contraption, which is like a childhood memory of mine. So if you're not, this is Marble Run. I'm sure you've seen this before. I actually delivered a similar session to a very young group who thought I was absolutely bonkers when I brought this up. So Marble Run's a good example, I guess, of momentum. And what it is you put the marbles in the top and they run down, basically. Gravity and momentum of a ball. So what do you need to build a marble run? Now, this would have been fun in real life because I would have got you to build one. But just imagine what would happen if I'd have got you into your group, split you into groups of 4 or 5 perhaps, and you were building a marble run. So firstly, to build it, to create any kind of momentum, you've got to have some kind of strategy. Yeah, you've got to use teamwork, you've probably got to cooperate to a degree, and you've got to be determined to finish it. You maybe got to deal with difficult characters. You maybe will have to deal with things that go wrong, or arguments or disagreements. So think about building it first in terms of team. And then we think about momentum itself when we put that ball in the marble run. So put simply, momentum is a mass in motion. So the ball is going to run down and it's going to keep going until something stops it, if it's able to, in terms of gravity. Sometimes momentum can feel like when things are really going your way, and it can feel good, essentially, to have the ball running and running and running and reach the end, because that's what we've intended to happen. So in a sporting context, momentum can feel like when you're really on top of things, when you're really dominating a team perhaps, or when you have possession of the ball for a period of time. Of course, this doesn't always happen. It can be a series of good events. So equally in your careers, if you've had a succession of things that have happened week on week, month on month, then you can find that momentum's with you in that respect until you maybe get hit with an injury, or something happens in your family life, or you have a setback of another sort. So we can feel momentum over a period of time and not just in an isolated situation. So momentum can be different in that respect. Consecutive success. So even people that have experienced consecutive success in their life in terms of they've done well at primary school, they've done well at secondary school, they've done well in further education, they've done well in their sporting life, they've gone into early stages of their career and they've done well, and then they've been rejected from something, and that can be difficult because we've experienced the momentum of success in our lives. So momentum can be over a period of time. But we can also think of it in terms of an isolated situation. So you could think of a day, for example, or even smaller than that, sort of like a training session or something like that when there's a sense of momentum there. So bravery, performing under pressure and being able to deal with what happens with momentum is difficult. And often, if I were talking to a football team, for example, then it takes bravery to try and combat another team's increased momentum. When momentum is against you, it's difficult. That is when you've got to explore those resilience qualities inside yourself. And performing under pressure and bravery coexist for me. So you can be underperforming. You can be failing. But actually, performing under pressure in that way is... So performing under pressure and bravery can truly coexist, in my opinion. Whether performance is successful or not, bravery is really important when you come to those crucial moments. And sometimes those moments are really short, and sometimes you won't get any of those really key pressure moments. Sometimes they happen, once or twice in our careers, depending on what the context is. But bravery is really, firstly, not being afraid to look a certain way to others. So a lot of this is maybe a bit more of a social psychology topic in terms of how we think. Often we worry about doing things or appearing a certain way because of what other people might think. I think bravery is also being able to stick to your values and desires. So despite what other people may think, or despite what might be going on in a context, are you able to stick to what you believe in and what you want despite those things? Fighting for what you want, so having the courage, again, that notion of courage in terms of, how willing are you to keep going, whether that's your end goal, whether that is your super North Star, or a tube stop on the way, as we discussed in the last session. It's having the courage to be brave enough to pursue that. And I think often the biggest challenge with that is when we've started to doubt our own capabilities. So that's a consideration. How do you speak to yourself? What do you tell yourself in the situations where maybe you're doubting your ability, or you're doubting your resources even? And how can you be brave in those situations? And then you can look a little bit at your environment, the people around you, perhaps to a degree the things you can control. So whether you're choosing good people around you, or whether there are challenges in the people that are around you in a forced context. But high support from those people and high challenge is where we get really key gains in performing under pressure. So have a little think about that. And from a leadership perspective, if the leaders that you have around you, or if you see yourself as a leadership figure, are you offering that to others? And that's where teamwork's so important in lots of pressured situations, and teamwork can assist with bravery massively. So going right back to the first point of looking a certain way to others, when you're in a team unit and you know clearly what the team ethos is, and you know what's expected of yourself and others, then that's key in being able to highly support other people and being compassionate with other people, but also being able to place challenge on those people as well, and on yourselves. And reflection, so sense of satisfaction, which I think it's important to look back at difficult situations and actually be satisfied with yourself, be satisfied with the reaction or the path that you took in overcoming something. And I've just put this reset button up here because this can be just a useful, really quick task in terms of a visual thing. So if you're in a difficult situation, or you're having a bit of a thought process around something, sometimes pressing the reset button and taking yourself back a step can be helpful. So, and being brave enough to recognise that sometimes is a challenge in itself. We can talk a little bit more as we go on about visual techniques and those more psychological skills training techniques that might be useful to you in terms of visualising something, or having a prompting word or a cue word that you might use in certain situations. But the reset button, I think, can be effective in just is like a stop and identify, something's wrong here, or I just need to either calm down or I need to get up. You'll know what you might need best in a certain situation. The reset can help with that. So I'm just going to introduce you to this image. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about this image in a future session. But in terms of talking about resilience, I want you to just start to think about tough situations that you might face, and acknowledging how difficult situations might be difficult for each one of you in a different way. And the reason I put this image up, just to give you an example of this, there might be things on this slide which you feel you excel in already, or that you particularly lack. So it's identifying, are any of these really getting in the way of your resilience, or are any of these really helpful to your resilience already? So again, we're not going to dwell on this one too much because we'll explore this in a bit more detail in another session. But just to introduce you to this slide and the concept of resilience in challenging situations. So in a tough situation that you might be able to bring to mind now, just think, for example, your willingness to adapt, which is on the screen here. How important is that in terms of resilience, and how able have you been able to do that in the past? Might that be something you want to work on in the future? And this is where these sessions really come into their own, because some of these things will be very individual for all of you. So it's up to you now to go away and think, okay, what in this area I'm lacking, or in this area I actually think I'm strong, and I'm going to make it a super strength. Okay, just because no presentation of mine would probably be the same without some outlandish visual. So these two things, I mean, if we're talking about warriors, if you put a warrior in either of those as a costume, they're going to look a bit different, aren't they? So the one on the right is going to be your typical warrior, and the one on the left may be more comical. And the reason I've just brought these images to mind is how different they look, for obvious reasons, but they're serving the same function. So the one on the left, it's going to rain in life, things are going to get hard, things are going to be challenging, you're going to face difficult situations, you're going to fail, you're going to have to come back from things. And really this raincoat, which I think is rather fetching, illustrates that it's going to rain, so let's be prepared. So some of the things we'll go through in these sessions are kind of like your raincoat. So they'll allow you to be resilient to things. That the age-old saying of water off a duck's back. Sometimes you'll have to use that kind of analogy. Sometimes things will come at you, and having a skill set, or being resilient and having tools to enable you to move on from events, or not be negatively impacted by events like you may have done in the past. It's important to have that raincoat protection. And really, the warrior on the right is doing the same thing. That shield is doing the same thing. Okay, it's protecting us from stuff that's potential harm. So really, those images just illustrate how warriors come in all shapes and sizes, and our coping mechanisms at dealing with adversity also may be in different forms. So how can you prepare for tough times? A bit of foresight, so a bit of what if planning, a bit of strategic planning about what may happen in certain situations. What are the risks here? And some of that might be individual to you. What are the risks here to me? Given that my personality is like this, or given that my current state of mind is this. That doesn't mean that equals failure. That means consideration of, okay, what am I going to do in this situation? What's my biggest threat to myself here? So a bit of what if planning. And you have a choice about how you respond. So this is really key and simple thought. Everyone has a choice about how they respond in any given situation. So it's up to you what you decide to do next. Yeah, we often get caught in a thread of thinking, this has happened, so I reacted that way, and it's almost like we didn't have any choice or any control over that. But you do have a choice. And it's difficult to remind ourselves of that. We're in control of that. We may be heavily influenced by our emotions, but that is where psychology comes in for me. We're often influenced by our emotions, but our emotions come from what we're telling ourselves. Yeah, so how can you start to acknowledge, what am I telling myself in that moment? Because that's what's causing me to feel this emotion, and I'm acting on that. And that's really, really key. Okay, so you have a choice about how you respond. Striving for excellence, not perfection. So black box thinking is something else that we'll explore in a future session. And really that's about, we can't be perfect, we'll make mistakes, but what are we learning from those mistakes? And that's something we're told often in all sorts of situations, by teachers, by coaches, by managers, whoever it might be. Our leaders often tell us that we learn from our mistakes, but how do we really do that, and how do we feel about making mistakes? And how can we strive for excellence and be okay with the mistakes even when we don't want to make them? And that's a topic we'll explore in a little bit more detail. Being in the moment, again, touching on that mindfulness concept. Hopefully we'll do some more work on mindfulness, particularly performance-related mindfulness, and how it can really help us in key moments of decision making. Having good self-talk, so just linking in with what I just said there. What we tell ourselves in a situation is where everything stems from. It impacts on how we feel about something, what we believe about a situation, and therefore what we actually do, what behaviour comes as a result. The thing about self-talk, before I move on, is what's difficult about self-talk is we believe it, and that's why it's so difficult to change. You know, lots of psychologists might tell you to have a script of some kind, or a cue phrase, but unless you truly believe it, it's not going to impact on your emotions as truly as you'd want it to. Some people will talk about the fake it to make it phenomena, which can be effective in certain situations, but really we want to be thinking about what can we tell ourselves that's true, that we believe, and that's where rational thinking can really help us in difficult situations. It's not about lying to ourselves or pretending that we're feeling better than we are, but it might be being rational and realistic about how we can be and how we want to behave. Practice and assess bravery. So how brave are you in certain situations? We'll talk a little bit more about that because we haven't gone into huge amounts of depth on bravery. And don't give up. I think this quote is a really nice one. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. So success in itself doesn't mean, well, that's it, you've nailed life, and failure doesn't mean the opposite either. So just to wrap up, in terms of what now, think about how you can practice resilience, pressure and bravery. So how might you start to be able to introduce, going back to that very first slide that I made, that I put up for you, talking about listening to these things is great, but how do we then have the bravery to go and use that in real life? How can we actually use that in real life? So just start to think about that now. How can you practice being more resilient? What do you need to learn about your own resilience in order to progress in that area? What's stopping you and what's keeping you going? So I really like this phrase, because often when we feel a certain way, or if I have a client in any field that feels a certain way, I might ask them, what's made you feel that way, and then what's keeping you there. So if you're feeling negative about something, okay, well, what was the trigger for that? But why are you still negative? Because there's something that's keeping it going, and that's keeping the momentum of your emotion. That's kind of a link in with the marble run, I guess. My favourite saying, a smooth sea never made a skillful sailor. So we don't get to where we want to go by having a smooth ride. We learn along the way, and those moments can create a bit more bravery in us. They can create a more resilient version of us, and force us to assess skills that maybe we need more of, or skills that we have and we want to develop more. What are you telling yourself in key moments and before key moments? So this is something that sounds easy done, but often if we don't really know what's going on for us in those key moments, they're really difficult to try and change or try and adjust. And finally, are you able to stay in the moment, grounding yourself? So again, that link in with mindfulness, and hopefully we can progress that in terms of using mindfulness to aid performance, and high pressure performance in particular. So that is it from me. Thank you for listening. I hope that was useful. I've kept it pretty close to the half an hour mark, and I'll look forward to expanding on that in another session. Thanks a lot.